Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time talking episode 5 of Agent Carter called The Iron Ceiling. Now, the title, of course, obviously being a bit of a mishmash between the glass ceiling, which we've all heard of, and the Iron Curtain. And if you're one of my younger viewers, or you just really were never very good at social studies, the Iron Curtain is kind of what they call sort of the metaphorical divide between the communist nations and the democratic nations back during the Cold War. So for basically from the latter part of the 1940s all the way up until like the late 80s, early 90s, this was a very prominent idea in just sort of Western politics and honestly world politics as a whole. It was basically, as they kind of put it, there was, the communist world, comprised of Russia and China, and then there was the free world, which was basically sort of the United States and the various European nations west of a certain line in the sand, basically. And of course, there are more countries involved in both situations, but you understand what I'm getting at. Anyway, so this sees Peggy finally just saying like, okay, I'm through sort of, I've been, Howard's let me down. I'm through sort of pretending to be something I'm not. I'm going to go and show the guys I work with who I really am. And she manages to get the Howling Commandos to come in with nothing more than a phone call and in just a couple of minutes. Therefore, really demonstrating to both her boss and, of course, to Thompson that Peggy is more than just the lady who gets you coffee. And of course, a big part of this episode is Thompson really getting to see just what Peggy Carter is really made out of. And of course, Peggy is very happy to be back around the Howling Commandos, who accept her without, the slightest reservation. She's fought with them, she's been around them for a long time. They survived the war together. They absolutely know that Peggy is totally top notch, which is, of course, part of the reason why Dugan invites her to join them at the end of the episode. Now, this is also an episode where we kind of get to see more insight into Thompson. I really like how they just sort of threw it, like his boss throws it like, yeah, whatever. I can tell that you're sweet on Peggy and all of that. Which is totally not the read that I got on the guy, but in retrospect, it does make sense. He's sort of the guy who doesn't know how to deal with a girl he likes, so he makes fun of her just because, at least that gets him attention from her. And then Thompson tells us that story about, how he feels like an enormous fraud for, winning the Navy Cross and all of that. Now, you'd think that most people who are veterans would probably be thrilled for the chance to sort of swap stories with, soldiers as legendary as the Howling Commandos. But Thompson has to be prodded into it. And of course, then we find out why. That he basically massacred 7 Japanese soldiers who were not trying to attack his comrades, but were actually trying to surrender. Now, I'm not entirely unsympathetic to Thompson here. Now, one, he admits that he'd been dozing on Duder, so he wasn't really, thinking very clearly. He just sort of reacted to what he saw in front of him. But what you have to understand about that time and that situation is that back during the Second World War, the soldiers who were fighting off in the Pacific, the Navy, the Army, and all those guys, the Japanese kind of freaked them out because those guys would just literally not surrender for anything. And you might have heard about a guy who was a Japanese soldier who got left behind on an island during the Second World War, and it wasn't until the 1970s that somebody had found this guy who had spent a good part of the remaining decades, killing any locals who came too close to his little hut or whatever. And they tracked down his old commanding officer from Japan and got that guy to basically say, like, yeah, dude, the war's been over for like 25 years. You really need to stop this. I mean, that's just how fanatical some of these guys were. And if you've even watched like old World War II documentaries, there's footage from the Pacific War of Japanese soldiers jumping off cliffs to their deaths rather than surrender. I mean, that was the thing that really just freaked the Americans out more than anything. These guys would just not give up. They would like hide in caves and have to be burned out with flamethrowers rather than just be taken prisoner and go to a POW camp, which admittedly not exactly, a beach vacation, but certainly gets beats being roasted alive with a flamethrower. Now, of course, there are always exceptions, and yes, every once in a great while, a Japanese soldier would say just like, okay, I give. But this was so rare, and the idea of like 7 of these guys surrendering all at once, I mean, to a soldier from that time and that place from the American side, this is unthinkable. It is just something that did not happen. Again, you might occasionally have 1 or 2 guys surrender, but a bunch of Japanese soldiers surrendering together, just did not happen. Or at least it was so rare that, it might as well be diamonds falling from the sky. So Thompson honestly did react in a perfectly logical way given what he knew at the time. But that doesn't make his guilt any less. He killed guys who were trying to surrender, guys who had given up, guys who had come into that place under a white flag. And then he covered it all up and spent all this time just sort of basically living a lie, and it's been destroying him ever since. In a lot of ways, Thompson is kind of the anti-Captain America. And yet Peggy's still there, inspiring him, showing him sympathy, especially showing this to a guy who's been nothing but a dick to her. That sort of shows that who had the true strength of character there. And let's see. Of course, we also get a look at the early days of the Black Widow program. Now, it's never explicitly referred to this using that name, but we can all tell what it is, and behind the scenes, the producers and such are calling it that. It is indeed the Black Widow program. And this is also where we get to see a little bit of Dottie snooping around in Peggy's apartment, and that whole thing with the string on the door lock. Again, that's classic spy espionage trick. Old school, but very low tech, and very effective most of the time, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's maybe not quite as savvy as you are. But Dottie definitely knows her stuff, and just seeing her poke around in Peggy's apartment and even try on Peggy's lipstick and sort of her British accent. I mean, it is really, really creepy, but it's also kind of fun. I mean, again, we're kind of going the idea that as much as Peggy has been through, and is the kind of camaraderie she has with the Howling Commandos, it actually might be somebody like Dottie who really kind of understands her best. And I love that bit at the end where Dottie has to handcuff herself to the bed in order to sleep at night. It just shows how ingrained this training is. And so if you stop and think about that, then the idea that Natasha years later would break free and become an Avenger, well, that makes it an even more impressive accomplishment. And kind of given the insight into there that what kind of blood she must have on her hands, and the fact that Clint was able to kind of get her to snap out of it, well, that also makes that whole situation, Clint's accomplishment in getting Natasha to snap out of it, and it really clarifies the bond between those two. It's like Clint managed to really get her out of a really, really nasty situation, and this is our first time to really get a good idea of just how mentally messed up Natasha must have been, and how grateful she really must be to Clint for kind of getting to her to where she is now. And let me see. Yes, of course we also see Sousa finally put 2 and 2 together and realize, hey, Peggy Carter really is more than she seems. So obviously that's going to be going somewhere interesting pretty darn soon. And we even get a nice little moment where Jarvis talks with the boss man, and there's this really nice moment where he kind of goes to scratch his ear, but then he catches himself because he remembers what Peggy said about how you scratch your ear when you lie. And then we also see the boss guy going and talking with this informant guy who's played by John Glover. Oh God, I love John Glover. Now, most people are going to remember him as Lionel Luthor on Smallville. He was actually also the voice of the Riddler on the 90s Batman the Animated Series. I always think of him as the devil on Brimstone. I mean, that is the character he played. He was literally like the devil. And yeah, Brimstone was a short-lived show that was basically add that to the list of really cool shows that were on Fox but got canceled because the network was stupid. Yeah, that was a cool show. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you this time around. This is another very solid episode, and I think it does a nice job of pushing us towards the climax of this series. I am totally up to see what happens next. So anyway, as always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.